The cameras were rolling when Donald Trump said the words that would change everything. He was mid-sentence, leaning forward in the guest chair with that familiar confidence, his red tie perfectly knotted, his blonde hair catching the studio lights as he gestured with his hands. The movements were deliberate, practiced, the gestures of a man who had spent decades commanding attention in boardrooms and now commanded it in television studios. The Late Show studio hummed with its usual controlled energy. The iconic skyline backdrop glowed behind David's desk, Manhattan's lights twinkling like distant stars against the deep blue curtains. The audience filled every seat, 300 people, who had waited hours for this moment, some clutching their phones despite the no recording policy, others sitting with their arms crossed, unsure what to expect from this particular guest on this particular night. David Letterman sat behind his familiar mahogany desk, his fingers steepled, watching Trump with the careful attention of a host who'd spent 33 years navigating controversial topics. At 68, David had interviewed presidents and comedians, Nobel Prize winners and reality stars, but something about tonight felt different. The air in the studio carried a charge, the kind of electricity that builds before a storm. Trump was in his element, talking about border security and immigration reform with the certainty of someone who had never questioned his own perspective. His voice carried across the hushed studio, each word delivered with the kind of authority that had made him famous long before he entered politics. These people, Trump was saying, emphasizing the phrase with a slight pause, they come here and they don't appreciate what America has given them. They take our jobs, they take our opportunities, and they never give back. They never say thank you. Never. It's like they think America owes them something. In the corner of the studio, barely visible to the cameras and completely invisible to the audience, Maria Gonzalez felt something crack inside her chest. She was sitting at a small, specially designed desk positioned just out of frame, a workspace that most viewers never knew existed. The desk held a complex array of equipment, professional headphones, a high-quality microphone, a monitor showing the live feed, and a small lamp that provided just enough light for her to read her notes without interfering with the studio lighting. Maria wore a conservative navy blazer over a white blouse, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. At 45, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to navigate two worlds simultaneously. For 12 years, she'd been the invisible voice that made late-night television accessible to Spanish-speaking audiences across America, translating not just words, but cultural references, humor, and nuance from English to Spanish in real time. She'd started this job when her own daughter was in high school, when the flexibility of evening work allowed her to maintain her practice as a pediatric cardiac surgeon while being home for family dinners. The irony wasn't lost on her. During the day, she saved children's lives in operating rooms where everyone knew her name, her reputation, her credentials. At night, she became a voice without a face, a bridge between languages that most people took for granted. Maria had learned to be invisible long before she became a translator. It was a skill she'd developed as a child in the 1980s, when being noticed meant being different. Being different meant being unwelcome, and being unwelcome meant your family might have to leave the only home you'd ever known. Even now, decades later, she instinctively made herself smaller when powerful people were speaking, when conversations turned to immigration, when the subject of who belonged and who didn't filled the air like smoke. But Trump's words hit her like a physical blow. Not because they were new. She'd heard variations of them countless times over the decades, in grocery store lines and school board meetings, in medical conferences and social gatherings, but because she was hearing them while simultaneously translating them into Spanish for thousands of families who were probably watching at home right now. Families in Los Angeles and Miami and Phoenix and Chicago, families who looked like hers, families who had stories like hers, families who were being reduced to these people by a man who had never bothered to learn their names or their contributions. Her hands began to shake as she continued translating, her voice steady and professional, even as her heart raced. She'd built a career on being neutral, on being the conduit for other people's words without injecting her own feelings. But something about this moment, about translating words that dismissed her very existence to an audience that included her own community, felt impossible to bear. David noticed the change in energy before anyone else did. After 33 years of hosting television, he'd developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when something was shifting in his studio. He glanced around the set, his eyes moving past the cameras and the audience until they found Maria. She was crying. Silently, professionally, but unmistakably crying. Tears were streaming down her face while she continued her translation, her voice never wavering even as her composure crumbled. "Mr. Trump," David said suddenly, interrupting the former president mid-sentence. "Hold on just a second." Trump stopped talking, his eyebrows raising slightly. The audience turned to look at David, sensing that something unscripted was about to happen. "I want to introduce you to someone," David continued, standing up from behind his desk. "Maria, could you come here for a minute?" The studio fell completely silent. This wasn't how talk shows worked. Translators didn't become part of the conversation. They stayed in the shadows, invisible and neutral, facilitating communication without becoming participants themselves. Maria looked up, startled. She shook her head slightly, pointing to her headphones, indicating that she was working, that she couldn't leave her post. But David was already walking toward her, his expression gentle but determined. "Ladies and gentlemen, David announced to the audience and the cameras, "I want you to meet Maria Gonzalez. She's been translating this conversation into Spanish for our Latino viewers for the past 12 years, and right now she's crying." The cameras swung toward Maria, capturing her in a moment of raw vulnerability. She stood up slowly, removing her headphones with trembling hands. The audience could see her face clearly now. The tears, yes, but also the dignity, the intelligence, the decades of experience written in the lines around her eyes. Trump watched from his chair, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked almost like confusion. This wasn't part of the script either. This was the kind of moment that made politicians uncomfortable, when real people entered the conversation and made abstract policies personal. "Maria," David said gently, "would you mind telling Mr. Trump your story?" Maria looked at Trump, then at David, then at the 300 people in the audience who were watching her with rapt attention. For a moment she considered declining, returning to her desk, disappearing back into invisibility. It would be safer. It would be easier. Instead, she began to speak. "I came here when I was 8 years old," she said, her voice quiet but clear, each word carefully chosen. "My parents brought me from El Salvador, not because they wanted to leave their home. They loved El Salvador. They loved their families, their community, their life there. But staying meant I might not live to see 9. The studio was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming in the ceiling, the soft whir of cameras adjusting their focus, the almost imperceptible rustle of 300 people holding their breath simultaneously. Trump leaned forward slightly in his chair, his usual fidgeting stilled, his attention focused entirely on this woman he'd never noticed before this moment. "There was a civil war," Maria continued, her voice growing steadier. "My father had been a teacher, my mother worked in a clinic. They weren't political people, Mr. Trump. They just wanted to help their community, but helping people can be dangerous when powerful men are afraid of change." She paused, her hands clasped in front of her. "One night, men came to our house. They told my father the teachers who taught children to read were teaching them to rebel. They gave my parents 3 days to leave the country, or they would come back for all of us." David moved closer to her, offering silent support. In the audience, people were reaching for tissues. The abstract concept of immigration becoming personal and immediate. "We didn't speak English," Maria said. "We didn't have money. My parents sold everything just to pay for bus tickets to the border. We didn't have connections. What we had was hope. Hope that America would give a little girl a chance to become something more than a victim." She turned to address the audience as well as Trump. They put me in public school in East Los Angeles. Mrs. Peterson, my third-grade teacher, stayed after school every day for months to help me learn English. She used her own money to buy me books. She called my mother and used a neighbor as a translator to explain homework assignments. David moved closer to her, offering silent support. In the audience, people were reaching for tissues, recognizing something universal in her story, even if the specifics were foreign to their own experience. They put me in public school, Maria said. Teachers who barely spoke Spanish stayed after hours to help me learn English. Librarians helped me with homework. Neighbors invited us to community events so we could learn how to be Americans. She turned to look directly at Trump, her tears still flowing, but her voice growing stronger. Mr. Trump, you said we don't appreciate what America gave us. You said we never say thank you. But I need you to know something. Her voice grew stronger, more confident as she prepared to share the part of her story that she'd never told on television, never shared with anyone outside her family and closest colleagues. I became a pediatric cardiac surgeon. For the past 15 years, I've performed surgery on children's hearts. American children. Children whose parents look like you, children whose parents look like me, children whose parents come from everywhere, children who were born here, children who came here as refugees, children whose only common bond is that they needed someone to save their lives. The weight of her words settled over the studio like a revelation. Trump's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His usual quick responses, his ready comebacks, his practiced deflections, all of it had evaporated in the face of this woman's lived experience. Last month, Maria continued, her voice growing more passionate, I operated on a 3-year-old girl named Emma Rodriguez. She was born with hypoplastic left heart syndrome. Essentially, half of her heart was missing. Without surgery, she would have died before her 4th birthday. Her parents, Carlos and Anna, had worked double shifts for 2 years to save money for the operation. Carlos washes dishes at a restaurant. Anna cleans office buildings at night. They had insurance because of jobs they got through the opportunities this country provided. She paused, letting the human details of the story sink in before continuing. The surgery took 9 hours. 9 hours of reconstructing a heart smaller than my fist, working with tissue so delicate that one wrong move could end a child's life. When it was over, when I told Carlos and Anna their daughter was going to live a normal life, you know what happened? The audience was completely still. Anna fell to her knees praying in Spanish, thanking God and America. Carlos grabbed my hands and said, Doctora, how do we thank you? How do we thank this country that gave our daughter life? And I wanted to tell him, you don't thank America, you become America. You contribute to it, you make it better. Maria's voice caught slightly. But the truth is, Mr. Trump, I was the one who should have been grateful. When her father said, thank you for saving our baby, I wanted to tell him, thank you for letting me become the person who could. The silence that followed was profound. Not empty, but full. Full of recognition. Full of understanding. Full of the kind of truth that cuts through rhetoric and reaches something deeper. David walked over to Trump, who was sitting absolutely still in his chair, staring at Maria with an expression that was difficult to read. Mr. Trump, David said quietly, I think Maria is trying to tell you that gratitude isn't always spoken. Sometimes it's lived. Trump looked at Maria for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual, stripped of its typical bravado. What's your daughter's name? He asked. Emma, Maria repeated, though she hadn't mentioned Emma being her daughter. But she's not my daughter. She's just a child I was honored to help. Trump nodded slowly. And your parents? Are they still alive? My father died 2 years ago, Maria said. But yes, my mother is still alive. She lives with me. She never learned perfect English, but she learned to be an American grandmother. She bakes cookies for my neighbor's children. She volunteers at the library where strangers once helped me with homework. She gives back every day, just not in ways that make headlines. David sat down on the edge of his desk, letting the moment breathe, letting the full weight of what was happening settle over everyone in the studio. You know what she told me before she died? Trump asked suddenly, though no one had asked him anything. Maria shook her head. My grandmother, she came here from Scotland, spoke with an accent so thick half the neighbors couldn't understand her. And she used to tell me, Donald, this country doesn't owe us anything. We owe it everything. The audience was completely still. Trump looked down at his hands, then back up at Maria. I forgot that, he said simply. I forgot that we all came from somewhere else. I forgot that being grateful doesn't mean being quiet. Maria walked over to where Trump was sitting. Without saying anything, she extended her hand to him. He took it, standing up to face her. Mr. Trump, she said, you're not these people either. You're not your worst moment or your harshest words. You're a human being just like me, just like my mother, just like Emma's parents. You're us. Trump's eyes filled with tears he clearly hadn't expected. For just a moment, the cameras captured something that transcended politics, transcended disagreement, transcended the careful boundaries of public discourse. Thank you, he said to Maria, and it was clear he meant more than just for her words. David stood up and addressed the audience directly. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a break, but before we do, I want you to remember something. The stories that change us aren't the ones we see coming. They're the ones that happen when we stop talking long enough to listen. The cameras cut to commercial, but nobody moved. Trump was still holding Maria's hand. Maria was still crying, but now she was smiling too. And David Letterman, who had spent 3 decades orchestrating moments of entertainment, realized he had just witnessed something much more important. He had witnessed the moment when 2 human beings remembered that they belonged to each other.